Hi everybody. We need to talk today about how the rebellion will actually get started. And we'll begin by revisiting a theme that we talked about during the last lecture set, which was the theme of tensions building between the colonists and the British authorities in North America. We talked about the Boston Massacre. We're going to see another protest in the city of Boston several years later in 1773. When we see the colonists protesting the Tea Act that was passed by Parliament. In this case, the colonists are so suspicious, so angry at Parliament, that even though this Tea Act actually will help to lower the cost of this popular beverage in the colonies, they don't care about that. They just see it as another instance of the British interfering with their way of life. So what we'll see in November of 1773, a group of about 100 to 150 of colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians will board several English ships docked in Boston Harbor, and they will proceed to dump about 340 chests containing some 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea into Boston Harbor, an incident that became known as the Boston Tea Party. The response from Lord North, who is Prime Minister at this point in time, is outrage. He and Parliament will immediately work towards getting the coercive acts passed after the Boston Tea Party to punish those responsible. And these coercive acts become known as the intolerable acts in the colonies, because to the colonists, these provisions are simply intolerable, unacceptable. So, for instance, the coercive acts will simply close the port of Boston until somebody pays for all that expensive tea that was just wasted and dumped into the harbor. So what this means for Boston is this is a busy port city. Unemployment is going to spike. All these other industries that depend upon ships coming in and out freely, it's just going to be an economic disaster for the city of Boston. That's unacceptable to them. Also, they will lose their ability to nominate their own governor and vote in their own governor. Now, the king and parliament are going to appoint a military governor of their choosing. Also, the terms of the Quartering Act will be extended so that now British soldiers can be stationed in individual homes in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you can bet if you were someone that was thought to have participated in the Boston Tea Party, you're going to hear that knock on the door, and you're going to have to now host some British soldiers in your home. Outrage among the colonies is immediate, and really it's going to have a major ripple effect. Even for those colonies not directly affected by the coercive acts, they are sitting up and paying attention to these events. If it can happen in Massachusetts, that means that next it might be Maryland, or next it might be Georgia, or New Hampshire, what have you. So we're going to see that outrage and fear are so widespread amongst the colonies that we'll have the first Continental Congress will be convened in 1774 in Philadelphia. Figures like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Washington are coming to discuss some of these issues. They're not yet ready to break away, however, from Britain. It would seem that would be almost suicidal at this point in time, and it would have been. Instead, they will simply list their grievances, send this list of complaints to the king and parliament, and hope that they're heard. Not only that, they will also impose a limited boycott of British goods to the colonies. They're going to stop buying British goods for 1 year, and then they're going to resume after that year buying British goods, but then they're not going to sell American goods to the British. They're hoping that this will send an economic message to members of Parliament, hit them in their pocketbook, and get their attention. You must stop trampling all over our rights. And then finally, they will agree to meet 1 year later to kind of circle back and see whether or not the limited boycott is actually working to get the job done. No one could have anticipated, however, the fact that the colonists will start to take matters into their own hands. In April of 1775, the following year, we have a contingent of British soldiers that are tasked with marching from Boston to the city of Concord in Massachusetts colony. They're told that there's a cache of weapons that the colonists have been hoarding, and the British are concerned about this. So they will send out a contingent of about 900 troops to go check this out. Before they can even get to the city of Concord, though, they will be stopped by armed colonists who will begin shooting at them at the town of Lexington, and they will return fire. The soldiers will continue, the British soldiers will continue marching on to Concord. They will not find that horde of weapons that they had heard was there, but then they were met with more armed colonists in Concord, and more shots are exchanged. Ultimately, this contingent of British soldiers, as they begin marching back to Boston, will lose even more of their numbers, as colonists, again taking matters into their own hands, will begin picking them off along their return route. The British will lose nearly 20% of their original forces and will have to be rescued by reinforcements. So this is unexpected. The following month, in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress will meet. Remember, they said they'd circle back a year later and see what was happening. No one anticipated that violence would have happened. And so, as violence escalated, we're seeing that the colonists at the Second Continental Congress will draft a resolution to really try and once more protest what they consider to be the outrages being perpetrated against them by their own government. This will become known as the Olive Branch Petition. And as you can see here, they're listing one after the other, a standing army, the judges of the courts are basically ruling against the people. The customs agent, which is to say tax collection agents, can simply break open people's houses and enter them without due process of law. They are mad and they want to be heard. But also, they're worried about declaring war. Rightly so. So what they're going to do is begin preparations for war by naming George Washington as head of the Continental Army. He will be chosen to begin raising militia units so that if this final attempt at peace, this Olive Branch Petition, is not received by the British, and they have to move on to war, that they will at least be prepared for that eventuality. And so, coming back again to the previous slide, what we're going to see is, of course, Parliament and the King laugh off the Olive Branch Petition. They're not interested in making nice with the colonists. Instead, they are angry. They're alarmed that the colonists actually feel like they can stand up to them in this case. So the Continental Congress will continue to meet after its second meeting in 1775. It will meet again in 1776, and as you can see here on the slide, ultimately this group of people will actually turn into the default government of the colonies during the American Revolution. All right, so moving on, the writings of Thomas Paine will also help kind of light a revolutionary fire under many of the colonists during this time period. Locke fell in with Benjamin Franklin. The two struck up a friendship while Benjamin Franklin was living in London for a number of years before the Revolution, and Paine will become deeply sympathetic to the colonist cause, that their rights are being infringed upon or being trampled. When he comes to the colonies in this period just before the Revolution is beginning, he will put pen to paper and author the very influential pamphlet that will become known as Common Sense. Here are some little extracts from his very popular pamphlet that sold more than 100,000 copies within just 3 months of it being published. And you can see here that he's very clearly influenced by John Locke. In this first paragraph, he's talking about government as a kind of a necessary evil, but over time it can become intolerable. And for that reason, an intolerable government, much like John Locke said, is a government that the people have a right to revolt against. All right, and he's going on to offer some arguments about, he uses the analogy of a child, for instance, that just because the colonies have grown and done very well under the leadership of Great Britain, that just like a child grows up and starts to become more independent, that it needs to start making decisions for itself, that just like that, the colonies have gotten too big, too complicated. It's time for them to break away and assert their independence. And so when thinking about fighting against the largest navy in the world and one of the largest armies in the world, this is what the colonists are having to contemplate, a formidable task. Another factor that starts to kind of light a fire, revolutionary spirit, a fire of revolutionary spirit for the colonists will be the prospect of an alliance with a foreign power. George Washington, among a number of other colonial leaders that are trying for peace, but are also preparing for war in case that happens, are realistic to know, or enough to know, that they can't do this alone. Okay, they're going to have the help of an established foreign power that might be willing to side with the colonists in their fight for independence against Britain. Who better to ask than France? And France will show some very clear interest in helping out the Americans in this case. France and Britain had been long-standing rivals for hundreds of years. Not only that, but France had recently lost to the British in the 7 Years' War and lost most of their land claims here in North America. So as far as the French were concerned, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. They don't really care so much about the Americans, but the fact that the Americans will be fighting the British, oh yeah, they want some of that action. The prospect of an alliance between the colonists and the French, in this case, is what continues to get the war effort up and running. But France wants some clear proof, however, that the Americans are not just running their mouths about actually revolting from England. They want some unequivocal and clear proof that if they agree to help the Americans, that the Americans will actually go through with a full-scale rebellion. The proof that they get will be drafted during the summer of 1776 by the Second Continental Congress. Thomas Jefferson, among many others, including John Adams, for example, Benjamin Franklin, will be part of a committee that will draft the Declaration of Independence. When this statement is drawn up, it will contain a list of grievances or complaints, many of which we've talked about before. Why, Parliament, why, King, do you continue to take away our rights in this case? And it will also assert the right to revolution, that an unjust government can and should be overthrown. Other Enlightenment principles were discussed, such as natural rights and equality for all, with the exception, of course, of slaves and Native Americans and women. But it will include that immortal line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Maker with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." By July 2nd, all but one colony, New York colony, had voted for independence. And so this document will be drawn up as a formal, very public announcement that the colonies had had enough and that they were getting ready to declare their independence. By July 4th, the Declaration was formally approved by the Continental Congress, and that's why we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day. Now France offered its support to the Americans and the war was officially on. But it's going to be a tough go for both sides, and we'll talk more about the war in our next lecture.